Hi, welcome back to Hydroponics Daily with me, Dr. Russell Sharp, and today's subject is houseplants, and I hope to cover something for everybody, from amateurs who have just got a few houseplants on their windowsill, through to really keen houseplant growers, all about the care of houseplants, and then through to people who are looking to cultivate houseplants on a commercial scale. And we've got a few tips and advice on that as well. Okay, so houseplants. The first thing to consider, the first piece of advice I would say for anyone looking at houseplants is that 90% of all houseplants, when they die from overwatering. People kill houseplants with kindness, and you really want to be trying to underwater them if possible. So when a houseplant is overwatered, they sit with their roots in stagnant water, and this leads to anaerobic conditions, the production of ethylene, anaerobic respiration, which is very inefficient, toxic gases like hydrogen sulfide, smelly gases, and diseases can get into the plant from there. And so you'll see lots of plants that will die. And even plants that have evolved, lots of houseplants have evolved in the rainforest. So St. Paulia, Monstera, Philodendron, figs, they're all rainforest plants. However, they're not, even in the rainforest, they don't sit with their feet in stagnant water most of the time unless they're adapted to live in swampy conditions. So maybe something like, even things like figs, will suffer if you get stagnant conditions. So always keep the soil or the grow media or the compost dry, as not bone dry, but don't keep it wet constantly. And that also feeds into another area, is that in pest and disease, one of the big pests for houseplants is fungus gnats, and they thrive anywhere where there's moist, decomposing grow media. So if it's wet, if your grow media is wet and it's made out of cocoa or compost, it's going to be decomposing, and that's going to be really attractive to fungus gnats. They're going to aim in on anywhere where there's decomposing grow media, and then they will target and eat your plant roots. Also, counterintuitively, a lot of cacti and succulents die from underwatering. People just assume because they're an arid plant that you don't need to water them. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Again, they hate to be overwatered, and these are the plants that really will suffer if you overwater them. But in the summer, you can water them as regularly as many other houseplants. It's just in the winter you need to dial back and keep them dry. So cacti, often they can suffer from actually a lack of water. Another important point, a reason why a lot of houseplants die, is that in the winter, people put them in a warm room and they put them on windowsills that are above a radiator. And central heating in the winter is one of the biggest causes of death in houseplants. It's because the air coming off a radiator is extremely dry, very low humidity. Even though the room is a moderate temperature, that air coming off the radiator is much hotter and much drier. And so the plants simply just dry out. It's like putting your clothes on the radiator, putting your houseplants on a windowsill above a radiator. Worst thing you can do. And also, even if you have your houseplants in a warm room in the winter, unless they're getting lots and lots of sun, they are going to be using up calories because they're going to still be respiring. They won't have gone dormant. So the best place for a houseplant in the winter is a cool but not cold room with lots of sun, away from a radiator. So that's where a lot of houseplants you can go wrong with houseplants overwatering and then put them on a windowsill or near a radiator in the winter. Obviously, houseplants had a real boom during COVID and lockdown. Lots of people started collecting houseplants then, and that trend has continued. It hasn't just died off with COVID. And there was a big boom in variegated and rare forms of variegated plants. Now, when it comes to those variegated plants, especially the monsteras and the philodendrons with the very white, clear leaves, maybe the half green, half white, because they haven't got functioning chloroplasts, they can't deal with the excess energy that comes from extreme sunlight. And so you really need to keep these even more shaded than you would what we call a wild type, a completely green monstera. So in my office here, I'm looking at one of the monsteras that is completely green, and all of the leaves, there's no scorch on it whatsoever. And we treat this plant really badly. We water it every few months and it's completely healthy. Now, in the other office, we've got a variegated monstera, and that is always suffering from scorch. And we care for it. We make sure it's got the adequate amount of water, but because it gets direct sunlight every now and again, because there's no chloroplast, the energy just breaks down the cells and kills them off. So to mitigate this, make sure that your variegated philodendrons and monsteras never are exposed to direct sunlight in the summer, and never let the plant dry out, because if it dries out, then the leaf temperature increases dramatically because there's no evaporative cooling of the water from the leaves. So that's a top tip for philodendrons and monsteras, or what we call Swiss cheese plants. So we said the main issue with complete beginners is that they overwater their houseplants. I'd say the main issue when it comes to really keen growers is they probably over-fertilize. And this is coming from somebody who is selling fertilizer. But you'll find that most houseplants are over-fertilized. And I would consider myself a good grower, especially of houseplants, but I have looked at the electrical conductivity of some of my houseplants coming out, and because you never actually get rid of the runoff, they can build up to really crazy high levels. So my number one top tip for anyone who's a keen grower is not to buy a fancy fertilizer. It's to buy an EC pen, an electrical conductivity pen. Way before you start messing around with pH pens, an EC pen is critical. And pour some normal water into the top of the pot, and then collect some runoff and measure the EC of that runoff. And if that runoff is not close to the EC of when you fertilize the plant, or double that, then if it's like 10 times that, then you've got a real problem. So what I would do there is take the plants outside and just feed them with water until the runoff went down to a reasonable level for what should be the fertigation solution, because you've got all those salts that have builded up every time you fertilized, and they're not going anywhere unless your plant's going crazy and you're harvesting the plant. So that's one thing you can do. You could, if you're in a flat, use something like a wet dry hoover to add to, obviously you can't take them outside, but you could hoover up the water and then put it down the sink or down the toilets or something like that. So checking the runoff EC for keen growers, I think that is the number one hack. If you took away anything from this podcast, that would be the one thing. And then when it comes to choosing your fertilizer, there are a number of things to consider. Obviously, gold leaf contains every essential plant nutrient. It's the only one-part fertilizer to do that. And so if you're adding a standard garden fertilizer or any standard houseplant fertilizer, and it's a liquid, it's probably going to be lacking calcium. And so you should be on the lookout for signs of calcium deficiency, which is blackened tissue, like the leaves have gone black, the new growth is black, the fruits are black, the flowers are black. And then if you're using a powdered product, signs of sulfur deficiency, which is the leaves aren't yellow. The leaves aren't very green, they're a light green. So not particularly yellow, but light green. And then if you have a pH meter, you could check the pH of the fertilizer you're using. Now, obviously, the ideal is between pH 5.5 and pH 6.5. And for every unit you go up or down, that's times 10. So it's a logarithmic scale, so it gets 10 times more of an issue. And so this can be a real issue. So I once tested Miracle Grow Herb, one that was designed for herbs, and it was a bright green product, and it had a pH of like 11 or 12. And that's crazy high. I don't know what was in it, but that was stupidly high. And then if you look at a lot of the plants grow, the formulations made specifically for houseplants, you might find, especially in the UK, there's ones like, you can get ones for bonsai, you can get ones for citrus plants, you can get, these very specific feeds. They may look good on the label, but if you actually test their pH, they can be crazily acidic. And that's not going to be good for your plants. That's going to strip out calcium even further and other elements. And so I would definitely, if you're using a houseplant specific fertilizer, check the pH. Make sure you're not doing that. Check the label, make sure there's no chlorides in there. And when it comes to tap water, either leave it 24 hours for the chlorine gas to bubble off, or add a dechlorinator, or even better, add gold leaf, or as it's called in the UK, liquid gold, because that will that will fertilize and dechlorinate at the same time. Now, I say I'm the inventor of gold leaf in the US and liquid gold in the UK. I'm also the inventor of a product called liquid gold leaf, which is sold to houseplant users, houseplant growers in the UK. However, I don't sell that product, and that product hasn't been formulated and improved since I invented it. So I would advise you to look for signs of iron deficiency if you were using that product, because it's a white product. It used to be gold, hence the name. And magnesium. Since I've moved on and produced liquid gold, we've increased the magnesium level as well. So those would be two I would be particularly looking at. And the other thing when it comes to houseplants is, if you are going to dilute the fertilizer because you're not going to use it all at once, then make sure you label the bottle. I am as guilty as anyone at this. I leave bottles hanging around and forget to label and think, I'll remember what that is. But this is a particular problem with houseplant growers. And it's because people take something like liquid gold or gold leaf and they dilute it in water, and it's cloudy to begin with, and then it becomes clear. And if you're diluted it in an Evian bottle, for example, and then leave it to one side, every year we get a number of calls from people who say, we've drunk the diluted fertilizer. Am I going to die? Is it going to be hazardous? And luckily, it's a non-hazardous product, but you don't want to be drinking fertilizer, especially if you're pregnant. It can be an issue. So don't leave unlabeled Evian bottles that have dilute fertilizer hanging around. It sounds obvious, but a number of people do it every year. Doesn't have a particular problem in hydroponics, standard hydroponics, because I guess that clientele, that user base, aren't drinking Evian. They're more like Monster Energy or Red Bull and stuff like that. So that's a particular problem. And then in winter, dial back your nutrition. I would stop fertilizing altogether in the winter. Obviously, other fertilizer manufacturers will say, oh, keep on fertilizing in the winter, just at a lower level. But I just don't think it's necessary. The other thing when it comes to building up EC levels and also stagnant roots is that you can have issues in things like terrariums where there is no allowance for runoff. And so if you were fertilizing a terrarium, you're going to get that buildup of the EC again and again and again. So maybe take some of the growing media, squeeze it, get some runoff, measure it with an EC pen. Is it crazy high? If so, try and flush your terrarium. Otherwise, it's going to build up over time. And then the other thing is, well, a lot of amateur growers, they don't realize that you're meant to have a plant pot inside a container. So the inner one is supposed to drain into the other, so that the grow media doesn't become stagnant. And some people just pot into the container, and obviously you're going to get really bad issues with build up there. So don't do that. When it comes to the grow media used, it used to be peat based or loam based, like John Innes, and now it's almost universally cocoa, apart from some carnivorous growers who still insist on using compost or sphagnum moss for growing their plants because they need a low nutrient, and they found that they can't grow the carnivorous plants in those. But most plants, vast majority of plants, thrive in cocoa. Disadvantage of cocoa is it doesn't hold on to nutrients, so feeding more often with a quality fertilizer like gold leaf or liquid gold is a really good option. When it comes to pests and diseases and weeds, you get all the same pests and diseases and weeds that you get in hydroponics, plus a few others. So spider mites are a massive issue. Fungus gnats are a massive issue. Thrips are a massive issue. If you want to deep dive into those, see the earlier episodes we did on those, on controlling them, identifying them, and things like that. But you also get other pests and diseases. And the two pests probably that you're going to get is aphids, mealybugs, whitefly. They're all very similar related sap-sucking insects. And that's because you're not growing in a grow room. And so you can't exclude those pests that you would if you were growing in a grow room. Now, some people do set up small little grow areas in their house or their flat and can exclude pests and diseases that way. And also the advantage of that is you can increase the humidity as well, because most houseplants like a high humidity, especially tropical plants. So that's good. If we move on to cultivation, and there is a lot of interest now in houseplant cultivation, especially in the UK, and that's coming from two particular areas. There's one is grow shops. The hydroponic industry in the UK is seeing a significant dip. It's not as thriving as it was, say, in lockdown. And so people are looking for other types of crops to grow. And houseplants is proving popular with a number of grow shops. They're setting up cultivations with houseplants. And then the other people looking to get into the houseplant cultivation sector are vertical farms. And there's a lot of interest from very large vertical farm companies who are experimenting with growing these houseplants. And they say that it's like they're doing it as like a research project, but they wouldn't be doing it unless they thought there was serious money to be made in it, because they've got shareholders and investors and they need to show return on that investment fairly quickly. So the competition they're going up against is the sort of countries or areas like the Canary Islands, where they grow vast quantities of houseplants, and they come in on what we call Danish trolleys, and they're fairly cheap, and they go into the big box stores. So that's one. That's where you're going to be struggling to compete on price. It's cheap and cheerful, and so the grass isn't always necessarily greener. Now, you can target the more expensive, rarer houseplants, the variegated forms and things like this. However, just setting up a grow and growing them and getting some cuttings is not going to be enough. You're going to need to invest a lot of time and effort in building up a social media following for your propagation. A lot of the extra money, what do you call it? The premium you can pay for these plants is because there's a story behind them, and the provenance of them and things like this. You've seen this with like dahlia farmers in the UK. That's where you're getting the premium from. Some houseplant growers, some houseplant florists turning into houseplant stores, they can pay a premium because there's a following. They're generating a following, and they're giving advice, and they are an influencer. So you can't just do that straight off the bat. And then there's also getting those rare genetics. You might be able to find rare genetics. You might be able to mutate some houseplants. I might do a podcast on how to mutate plants. That would be a good one, with a big health and safety warning at the start, because there are some dangerous ways of doing it. The catch-22 of selling these rare genetics, though, is that if you propagate them and sell loads of them, they suddenly are no longer rare, and they don't command the price. So there's something to consider there. The good news about growing houseplants hydroponically is that you can use a grow tent to exclude those normal pests and diseases. You can get really good increases in yield by adding CO2, and you don't need to use such a high light level that you would for other hydroponic crops, because these plants thrive in the understory of a rainforest most of the time, and so you don't need to blast them with loads of light to get really good levels of growth. The other advantage over a number of hydroponic crops is that you don't necessarily have to induce flowering. You take a Swiss cheese plant, for example. It's very rare that it flowers. We had one flower in our office, our variegated one. It was a very interesting flower, but it just sat there for about a year and a half producing a fruit, then dropped off, and the seeds weren't viable. It definitely wasn't growing for its fruits, even though its scientific name is Monstera deliciosa. I don't know how it got that name, because the fruit did not look in any way delicious or the sort of thing that you would want to be eating. It didn't look desirable. But obviously something like a peace lily or an orchid, you would definitely have to be in flower before you sold it. You would struggle to sell a peace lily or an orchid that wasn't in flower and on the promise that it would have amazing flowers. Propagation is normally by cutting or division. It's very rare that you would grow houseplants from seed. If you are growing them from seed, be very wary of seeds sold on eBay. eBay is notorious for selling seeds that are not true to type and are just of the completely different species. So buyer beware in that case. And then with cuttings, if you're buying in cuttings, always put them into quarantine, because if you bring thrips into your grow area, you're in for a world of pain. So don't do that. When it comes to cultivation rather than just houseplant care, you do have a few options when it comes to pest and disease control that are not open to the sort of home grower. So, for example, fungus gnats, we manufacture a soil sterilant that is great for fungus gnats, but we never even contemplate selling it for home houseplant growers, because it smells of rotting eggs. It's extremely hazardous, even though it can be used in organic farming. And so the idea of having something that would stink a house out with rotten eggs, we just wouldn't contemplate that. But in a cultivation grow room, you could just about get away with it, and you could use commercially available pesticides if you had a really bad problem in a cultivation sector that wouldn't be available to somebody growing them at home. Most home pesticides that are designed for home garden use, they have to be safe enough to be used without any PPE, whereas the commercial ones, they are registered and authorized on the assumption that people will be wearing, state of the art personal protective equipment, respirators, full bodysuit, rubber gloves, things like this, and obviously trained on how to use them safely, more importantly. I haven't covered bonsai in this podcast episode because bonsai are not a houseplant. There is an assumption certainly in Western countries that bonsai are houseplants, and lots of people try and buy bonsai for houseplants. However, this is a myth that is thought to be generated because when Western leaders would go over to Japan or China, where it's called penjing, then they would go into people's houses and they would find a bonsai on the table as a centerpiece. And they would say, oh, look at this tree growing on this table. It's a houseplant. In Japan, they have houseplants that are trees. That's not actually true. What's happened is they brought in a bonsai from outside, cleaned it up, put it on the table, and this is a sign that you are a esteemed guest and you've been welcomed in the house with a bonsai. But obviously, they didn't realize that people would go back to Europe and to North America and say, oh, they grow houseplants inside and they're trees. So in Japan, they're actually grown outside, even though they're in pots. Bonsai means tree in a pot, and you would struggle to grow them indoors. Obviously, there's things like figs that can be grown as an indoor bonsai, but they are not the most common species of bonsai in Japan, certainly. You're talking more pines and elms, maples, and these just would not thrive indoors. So don't try and grow them indoors. You want shaded areas outside of wind and extreme weather. That's the perfect conditions for a bonsai. Certainly the best, similar conditions for wasabi, really. So bonsai and Chinese penjing, they're definitely something to grow outdoors and bring in to the house on special occasions and then take them straight back out again. And if you're growing houseplants, you're probably bringing in a load of pests and diseases on them as well at the same time, which your houseplants won't be thanking you for. Interestingly, bonsai originated in China and was brought to Japan. So penjing is the original, but it was certainly refined and made into a real art form in Japan. So you can't give the Chinese all the credit. I like to say the Chinese invented everything apart from the camera to take pictures of the things they invented. But I think penjing we can certainly say they definitely invented. Probably 1,000 years ago, probably. Maybe that sounds about right, that, doesn't it? Other interesting houseplants like green walls, I think we'll cover in a separate episode because they're a law unto themselves and they require specialist irrigation and fertigation systems involving pumps and things like this. So they can stay for another day. So if you've liked this podcast, then please, as I say, give it a review. If you are on Apple, I'll run a competition and the funniest review can get one of our amazing hand lenses. So we sell a hand lens that has an LED light and a UV light for diagnosing pests and diseases, looking at trichomes, looking at mycorrhiza. So UV, mycorrhiza, you put them in the dark, they'll illuminate under UV. So you can see if your plants have got mycorrhiza and things like this. So we'll give out a free hand lens to anyone who gives the best review on Apple Podcasts. And that can be anywhere in the world. So we'll post it out. You might need to pay the tariff when it comes into your country if you've got a particularly bad import duty from the UK, but as long as you agree to pay that, then it won't come straight back to us. And so, yeah, the free hand lens for the funniest review. You can give it any style you like, because a true, honest review, that would be fantastic. So until tomorrow, that's been Hydroponics Daily for today. Houseplant care and houseplant cultivation.